Today I'm going to show you how to build a natural pond step by step. And as a bonus at the end of the video, I'll provide 5 design ideas for making your pond look more natural. Let's get started. The pond we're building today is the pond that I featured in my book, Building Natural Ponds. It belongs to a friend of mine, and he just happened to want to build a pond at the same time as I was writing the book. That worked out great. I gave advice to my friend, and he allowed me to take pictures that I could use in my book. The pond was going to be built on a fairly large piece of property. It's fairly level, but has a slight slope from right to left. Anytime you have a slope on a property, you have to give some thought as to how you're going to install the pond. Remember, water is always level. You'll also notice that to the right of this picture is a hill. Now the hill belongs to the neighbor, so we can't really use the hill, but we do have to consider it when building the pond. It has both an advantage and a disadvantage. We could build the pond right where that windmill is and use the hill to collect water for the pond. Every time it rains, water runs down this hill, and we can sculpt the landscape around the pond so that all the water is directed to the pond. That way, every time it rains, the pond is filled up automatically, and that would be a good thing. The problem with that is that any chemicals, like pesticides and fertilizers that are spread on that lawn will also come along with the water. And if we add nutrients from the lawn on top of the hill into our pond, we're going to create algae problems. So in this case, we decided that since the property to the right of this picture belongs to the neighbor, and we have no control over the kinds of chemicals that are sprayed on that lawn, that we want to keep that water out of the pond. And so we built the pond a little farther away from the hill, and we landscaped the property so that any water that comes down the hill will run around the pond into other parts of the garden. There are a couple of other things that we need to consider before we locate the pond. It's always a good idea to stay away from trees. We don't want to be digging around large tree roots. Makes the digging job harder, and if we damage too many roots, we'll kill the trees. So it's a good idea to keep the pond in an open area. We also have to decide how big to make this pond. Since this property is fairly large, it would look kind of silly to put a small pond on it. So the homeowner decided to make a good-sized pond here. Once you know where the pond goes and you know the size that you want, it's time to start digging. Digging the pond is probably the hardest job if you're going to do it by hand. So in this case, we decided to bring in some excavators. If you've never used one of these, they're a lot of fun, pretty easy to learn. If you're experienced with an excavator, you can dig out this pond in an hour or two. The soil in this area has a very high clay content, but very few stones. Now the fact that there are no stones there actually makes digging much easier, and we have less concern about sharp stones puncturing our liner later on. The high clay content can make digging a bit of a problem too. In the low area of the pond, you can see there's still water there, and the clay there simply turns into muck, making it difficult to work with. In the dry areas, the soil becomes hard as rocks. Clay can also be a big advantage. If you have a high enough level of clay in your soil, you might not need a liner. One of the things the homeowner had to decide is, do I go with a completely natural bottom and let the clay seal the pond and hold in the water, or do I put in a liner? The advantage of the clay is that it's much less expensive to build. You don't have to buy a liner. The problem with clay is that it's never 100% sealed. Clay bottom ponds always seep a little bit. Now, how much is this going to seep? You really don't know until you finish building the pond. So you're taking a bit of a chance that you'll be able to seal it with the clay. If we put in a liner, you're guaranteed not to have any leakage. In this case, the cost of the liner was fairly small, and the homeowner decided that they'd rather spend the money on the liner, make sure they don't have any leaks, than to worry about it and try and solve problems after the fact. So how do you know how much clay you have in your soil? Well, you can take a sample and send it to a lab, and they'll be quite happy to analyze it for you. The other option is to measure it yourself. And I've created a video called Soil Texture. And in that video, I show you exactly how to measure the amount of sand, silt, and clay in your soil. I'll put a link to that video in the description. This pond is being built around the 3rd week of May. The water table is still fairly high, and that's why it's not running away here. So we've taken a sump pump and we're going to pump out as much of the water as we can to dry up the area before we proceed with the liner. This picture shows a really important part of the design of the pond. In the center you have a wet area, and that's going to be the low part of the pond. To the left and to the right of this wet area are flat planting shelves. This is really important because we need a place to put lots of plants. And most water plants like to grow in a couple of inches of water. So what you want to do is design the pond so that there are areas around the outside that are going to end up with anywhere between 6 and 12 inches of space between the final layer of water and the bottom of the pond. When we fill this with rocks, that 6 to 12 inches will become 2 or 3 inches, which is just perfect for the plants. Once the digging is complete and the shape of the pond is the way you want it, it's time to start putting in the liner. Rubber liners are really tough material, but there's always a chance that the sharp rock underneath the liner will puncture it. To make sure that this doesn't happen, you want to put some sort of underlayment underneath that rubber liner. Now you can buy commercial products, and I've tried some of those from nurseries, and they're very thin, and I don't really like them. I don't trust them. Some commercial products called geotextiles can be used, and apparently they work. Another alternative is old carpet. Most of the carpet we use in homes today is completely synthetic. In effect, it's made out of plastic, so it doesn't decompose, and it's going to last as long as the liner. Find yourself some old carpet, which you can get from carpet stores, and use that as an underlayment. The easiest way to put the carpet down is by cutting it into smaller pieces and then overlapping the pieces. That's particularly useful in areas where you have a tight curve. It doesn't really matter whether that carpet is facing up or down, it works either way. Once the carpet is in place, it's time to add the pond liner. Put it in the sun, let the sun warm it up, and the liner becomes much easier to work with. Then lay it out in your pond, making sure it's in the right position, and start filling it with water. The weight of the water will hold the liner in place and press it against the bottom. As the water level is slowly coming up, walk around the pond, it's easiest to do from inside the water, and push all the creases out. Around the curves you're going to have too much liner because you're trying to take a square piece of rubber liner and put it in a round hole, and so you're going to have to make folds. Make the folds just like wrapping a Christmas present. At the ends of the Christmas present where you have too much paper, you make folds and lay them on top of one another. You do exactly the same thing with the pond liner. So as the water level is rising, go around and make sure all your folds are nice and neat, and keep pushing out the wrinkles. If you're still watching this video, I know you're hooked and you want your own natural pond. I can't explain everything there is to know about designing and building a natural pond in this short video, so I've written a book called Building Natural Ponds. It will give you lots more information and show you exactly how to do this. It's really quite simple. I'll put a link to this book in the description below. Now let's get back to building the pond. One of the things that I like to do is to take extra carpet and put it on top of the pond liner on the planting shelves. The reason for this is that the carpet prevents puncture from above. If I have to go into this pond and walk around on these stones, putting in new plants or cleaning up my plants, I'm not going to puncture the liner when I step on sharp stones. So in this picture you can see the pond liner to the left and some of the folds that are being made. You can see the carpet that's exposed straight in the middle of the picture, and that carpet is protecting and covering the pond liner. And then we've started adding the stones. Now you might wonder about the end of the pond there where there are no stones, and we don't really need them there, and you'll see why in a few minutes. At the opposite end of the pond, we decided to put in a beach area. So we've taken smaller stones and sand and made an area that slopes gently into the pond. This is great for walking into the pond in case you have to do some maintenance, and it's great for the animals. They can get in and out of the pond easily. They have an easy way to walk down and get a drink. If they happen to fall in at some point, they can easily walk out. When you're designing the pond, it's really important that you ask yourself this question. What happens when the water in the pond gets too high and overflows? Where will that water go? You want to design the pond so that the water goes in the direction that you really want, not just over the sides. Particularly in a pond that's built on sandy soil, if too much water runs over the edge, it can actually collapse the side walls of the pond. It's really important to direct the excess water away from your pond. So I like to add a spillway, and that's what's pictured here. So the spillway is the lowest spot around the whole pond. So it's the area that the water will run out first, and you decide what direction you want that to go. And then you put in some extra pieces of pond liner to make sure that the water runs away from the pond before it starts soaking into the soil. In our case, we've put the spillway at the lowest part of the garden, which happens to be right where the beach is. So if the water overflows, for instance, we get a really heavy rain, or we use the garden hose to fill the water and we forget to turn it off, we know that it's going to run away from the pond and not damage the sidewalls of the pond. Besides digging your pond, if you're going to do it by hand, the next biggest job is moving the rocks. And you're going to need more rocks than you think. So it's a good idea to hire some young, strong backs to help you move them. Now there are lots of choices for rocks, but the best rocks are local ones. They will end up making your pond look more natural. When you're designing your pond, think about how you're going to get down to the water level. You're going to want to watch your fish and see your plants. You're going to want a place to sit to enjoy the pond. In this case, we've decided to add a dock. You might remember in one of the earlier pictures, part of the liner was not covered with rocks. Well, this area is now covered with the dock, and so it didn't require any rocks. We decided to build a dock that overhangs the water. 4 concrete pillars were inserted in the ground outside of the pond, and they support the overhanging dock. I'm going to create a separate video on building decks, docks, and bridges for ponds. If you're interested in that, make sure you subscribe to my channel and you'll be notified when that video is released. The building of the pond is now complete. All we have to do now is add the fish and the plants. You can see a few plants added here, but that's not nearly enough plants. The homeowner is waiting for a large shipment of plants, and they will be put into the planting shelves as soon as they arrive. The plants are critical for making a natural pond. The plants act as filters. They're going to clean the water. They're going to take the nutrients out of the water, and with a very low nutrient level in the water, we won't have an algae problem. This is a view of the finished pond 2 years later. The plants are starting to grow and get established. The landscaping has been completed, goldfish have been added, and the homeowner just loves this pond. The first year after installation, the homeowner did have some algae problems. The reason for that was that the plants were not yet established. There weren't enough growing plants in the pond to take out the nutrients. This year has been different. There's no algae growth in this pond. They now have large, lush plants to clean the water for them, and the homeowner is just thrilled with this pond. So far in this video, I've discussed the process of actually building the pond. But what we haven't discussed is how to design it so that it looks very natural. Here are 5 tips that will help you make a more natural looking pond. Tip number 1, make sure you hide the liner. Most of the pond designs that I see are easy to build, but don't hide the liner. In my design, I hide the liner behind the planting shelves. Both the rocks and the plants cover up the liner so that you never see it. Even with changing water levels, you won't see my liner. Rocks are important to make the pond look natural. When you're selecting them, use local rocks and make sure that you change the variety of rocks that you get. You want small ones, large ones, in between, round ones, sharp ones, different colored ones. The larger that variety is, the more natural they will look. All you have to do is go visit a real pond and have a look at the rocks around the edge. They're not all the same size. When selecting plants, I suggest you get plants that are local to your area. Those will be plants that people expect to see near the water, and they'll be hardy in your area, so they'll be easy to grow. The one exception might be water lilies. If water lilies don't grow naturally in your area, I would still add them to the pond for several reasons. First of all, they shade the water, and that reduces the amount of algae growth you'll get. Water lilies are also a plant people expect to see in the water. And besides that, they're just really nice looking plants. Tip number 4 is don't be so neat around your pond. Don't have plants in nice round clumps. In nature, plants run into each other, and they spread until they can't grow anymore. Have odd-shaped clumps of plants. Let them intermingle a little bit, and then add some wood. Put a log along the outside, or maybe a tree stump, or a branch. Don't pick up every piece of wood that happens to fall off the tree. If you leave some sitting there, especially if they're overhanging the water a little bit, they will look so much more natural. My final suggestion has to do with the shape of the pond. If you make it rectangular, it looks very formal, so that's not going to work. Since you're buying the liner in a square or a rectangular shape, it's natural to make a round or oval type of pond. That gives you the maximum use of the liner. That makes a lot of sense. The problem is that a round or oval pond just doesn't look very natural. So you can do a couple things. You can change the shape of the pond. Use something like a kidney shape, and that will look better. But the way I handle this is I actually make my pond oval, but then vary the size of the planting shelves. Have some narrow shelves, some wide shelves. When the pond is finished and the plants are mature, the shape of the pond will be based on where the plants are and where the planting shelves are. Those can be very irregular inside the pond, and that way you'll end up with a pond that looks very natural. I hope these suggestions have been of some help and that you end up with a pond that you just love. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up. And if you want to see more videos like this, hit the subscribe button below. And then hit the little bell so you get notified. Thank you very much.